we're going to wander through the dim, incense-heavy corridors of the world's most powerful palaces. We aren't looking at the kings or the emperors themselves, though. No, tonight we're looking at the shadows behind them. We're talking about the eunuchs, the men who were surgically altered to be safe around the royal women, but who ended up becoming the most dangerous people in the room. It's one of those historical ironies that really makes you appreciate the chaos of human logic. The idea was simple. If you want to make sure your harem stays pure, you staff it with men who can't exactly complicate the bloodline. Because why trust your nobility when you can create a literal class of subservient, familyless officials? But, as history repeatedly shows us, if you take everything away from a person, their family, their ability to have children, their physical manhood, you don't necessarily get a loyal servant. Often, you get someone with absolutely nothing to lose and a lot of time to plot. Let's float over to the Forbidden City in Beijing during the Ming Dynasty. This was a place where thousands of eunuchs lived and worked. They were the only men, besides the emperor and his prepubescent sons, allowed into the inner court. It was a city within a city, filled with thousands of concubines, all of whom were technically the emperor's property. Now, imagine you're a eunuch. Your day starts before the sun is even up. You're responsible for everything. You carry the empress's sedan chair, you prepare the tea, you keep the records. But most importantly, you manage the selection. When the emperor wanted companionship for the night, it was often a eunuch who presented him with a tray of green-tipped tablets, each with the name of a consort. If the emperor liked you, the eunuch that is, he might pick the woman you suggested. If he didn't, well, that consort was going to have a very lonely decade. This meant the eunuchs essentially controlled the traffic of the imperial bedchamber. They were the gatekeepers of the womb. If a consort wanted to become a favorite, she didn't just need to be beautiful or smart. She needed to be very, very nice to the guy carrying the tray. And by nice, I mean bribes. Lots of them. Silk, gold, jade, whatever a consort could scrape together from her allowance usually went into the pockets of the eunuch standing by her door. Because why not have a little side hustle while you're managing the fate of the dynasty? It was a system built on a foundation of voluntary tips, which is a polite way of saying it was a massive protection racket. Of course, the eunuchs weren't just the help. Some of them became the de facto rulers of China. Take Wei Zhongshen, for example. He was a man who, let's be honest, wasn't exactly a scholar. He was a gambler who fell into debt and decided that becoming a eunuch was a better career move than dealing with his creditors, because when in doubt, just join the imperial civil service via the most painful route possible. Wei managed to become the best friend of the Tianqi emperor. Now, the Tianqi emperor was, let's call him, unfocused. He loved carpentry. He spent most of his time building furniture while the empire literally started to fall apart. And while the emperor was busy with his saw and his lathe, Wei Zhongshen was running the country. Wei was so powerful that he was actually called Lord of 9,000 years. For context, the emperor was the lord of 10,000 years, so Wei was essentially saying, I'm just one step below a literal god, and I'm definitely the one holding the checkbook. He built temples to himself, he had his own secret police. He was the man who controlled who the emperor talked to, what he read, and most importantly, who he slept with. But there's a certain tragic, dry humor in the way Wei's reign ended. When a new emperor, Chongzhen, took the throne, he wasn't really into furniture. He was into actually being an emperor. He looked at Wei's massive, bloated power structure and basically said, no thank you. Wei, realizing the party was over, took the honorable way out before he could be captured. It was a swift end to a man who had spent his life navigating the slowest, most intricate social webs in history. Let's float across the globe now, to the Ottoman Empire. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul had its own version of this drama, but with a slightly different flavor. Here, they had the chief black eunuch, also known as the Kislar Aga. The Ottoman system was fascinatingly bureaucratic. The harem wasn't just a party, it was a highly organized institution, and the chief black eunuch was the only person allowed to bridge the gap between the sultan's private world and the outside political world. He was the messenger, he was the guardian, he was the guy who knew every single secret whispered behind a silk curtain. The Kislar Aga often became the most powerful person in the empire after the sultan. Why? Because the sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, ran the harem and the chief eunuch was her right-hand man. Together, they could decide which son would succeed the throne and which ones would be, well, retired to the cage or the kafes, which was a suite of rooms in the palace where potential heirs were locked away for their entire lives so they couldn't start a civil war. It was like a very luxurious witness protection program, except you were the person everyone was hiding from. And who managed the cage? The eunuchs. They were the jailers of princes. Imagine being a prince in the cage. You have the best food, the best clothes, and a beautiful view of the Bosphorus, but you can never leave. And the only people you see, day in and day out, are the eunuchs who might one day tell you it's your turn to be sultan, or one day might bring you a silken cord to end the line. It was a life of quiet, gilded suspense, managed by men who had been removed from the cycle of life themselves. There's something incredibly still about that image. The eunuchs moving through the corridors of the Topkapi Palace, their shoes soft against the tiles, carrying secrets that could topple an empire. They were the revenge of the marginalized. They had been taken from their homes, often as children, and forced into a role that stripped them of their identity. But in return, they gained a different kind of identity, the identity of the shadow. In the Ottoman court, the eunuchs weren't just servants, they were educators. They taught the princes, they managed the royal finances. They were the ones who ensured the price of being the sultan's favorite was paid in full. If a concubine fell out of favor, it was the eunuch who escorted her to a lesser palace. If she rose in favor, it was the eunuch who carried her jewelry. The irony, of course, is that for all the effort put into making these men neutral, they were anything but. They were human. They had favorites, they had grudges, and they had a very long memory. Think about the atmosphere of these palaces. It wasn't the loud, clashing drama you see in movies. It was a slow, dripping kind of power. It was the sound of a whisper in a hallway. It was the way a eunuch might just accidentally forget to deliver a letter, or how he might happen to mention a particular lady's name while the sultan was feeling bored. The eunuchs were the masters of the small move. They didn't need armies, they just needed access. And because they were considered lesser by the noblemen outside the palace, they were often overlooked until it was far too late. They were the ghosts in the machine of the state. As you settle deeper into your pillow, just imagine the sheer weight of all those untold stories. Thousands of men who were meant to be invisible, but who held the keys to the kingdom in their scarred, silk-wrapped hands. They watched the queen sleep, they heard the king's cry, and they waited. They were the keepers of the bedchamber, and in the end, they were the ones who truly knew what it cost to be at the top. The palace is quiet now. The lanterns are flickering low. We'll leave the eunuchs to their plotting for a moment and float toward another story of royal dysfunction. Because the bedchamber wasn't the only place where things went sideways. So, we've seen the power players in China and the gatekeepers in the Ottoman Empire. But if you want to see where this practice really reached its most highbrow theological peak, we have to float over to the Byzantine Empire. Now, Byzantium, the eastern half of the Roman Empire that just refused to quit, was a place that loved two things: complicated church arguments and even more complicated palace politics. And right in the middle of both were the eunuchs. Unlike in other cultures, where being a eunuch was often a status of a slave or a captive, in Byzantium, it was sometimes a strategic career move. Parents would actually, well, they would prepare their sons for this life because it was the only way to reach the highest offices in the land. Because why let your son be a lowly soldier when he could be the emperor's most trusted advisor? It was a bit of a break the glass ceiling situation, except the ceiling was made of very specific physical requirements. In the Byzantine mind, eunuchs were seen as almost angelic. Since they couldn't procreate, they were thought to be closer to the divine, less distracted by the fleshy desires of the world. They were the third gender of the medieval world, existing in a space between the masculine and the feminine, which made them the perfect intermediaries for a god-appointed emperor. Imagine the Great Palace of Constantinople. It's a sprawling complex of marble, mosaics, and gold, overlooking the shimmering blue of the Bosphorus. And moving through these halls are the cubicularii, the eunuchs of the bedchamber. They weren't just pouring wine, they were the ones who literally dressed the emperor. They were the ones who touched the sacred person. In a world where the emperor was seen as a living icon, being the person who brushed his hair or adjusted his crown was the ultimate power flex. You weren't just a servant, you were the guardian of the imperial image. And because you couldn't have a family of your own, you couldn't start a rival dynasty, the emperor could trust you. Or at least that was the theory. Of course, the theory didn't account for the fact that even without kids, humans are remarkably good at being greedy. Let's look at a guy named Basil Lecapenus. Now, Basil was the illegitimate son of an emperor, and because he was a eunuch, he couldn't take the throne himself. But he did the next best thing. He ran the empire for 3 different emperors. He was the Parakoimomenos, which literally translates to the one who sleeps near the bedchamber. Imagine that title on a business card. Hi, I'm Basil. I sleep outside the emperor's door, and I basically decide if you live or die today. Basil was the ultimate survivor. He was smart, he was ruthless, and he was incredibly wealthy. He held the strings of the military, the church, and the treasury. He was so influential that when the young emperor Basil II, who would later be known as the Bulgar Slayer, finally decided he actually wanted to rule, his first major task was getting rid of the other Basil. It took a literal imperial tantrum to displace him. When Basil Lecapenus was finally exiled, the young emperor reportedly had all of the eunuch's laws and decrees struck from the records, as if he were trying to erase a ghost. But there's a softer, stranger side to this too. In Byzantium, eunuchs weren't just in the palace, they were in the choir. This is where we get into the soprano tragedy. Because their voices never broke, they kept that high, ethereal, haunting range of a child, but with the lung capacity of an adult. People in the Hagia Sophia would listen to these choirs and genuinely believe they were hearing the voices of angels. It was a beautiful, soaring sound that came at a very high personal cost. It's a bit of a dry irony, isn't it? The church, which preached the wholeness of the body, was the biggest consumer of a practice that required its literal destruction. But in the name of heavenly music, people were willing to look the other way. And then we have the eunuch saints. Yes, really. There were men who were celebrated for their purity and their devotion, their physical state seen as a living sacrifice. It was a world where being less made you more. But let's talk about the revenge part again, because while they were being called angels, they were also being treated with a huge amount of suspicion by the regular nobility. The bearded men, as they were called in the texts, were constantly complaining about the smooth-faced ones. They called them slippery, deceitful, and unnatural. It was a classic us versus them dynamic. The nobles had the land and the armies, but the eunuchs had the emperor's ear, and in Byzantium, the ear was mightier than the sword. If a general wanted a promotion, he didn't just win a battle, he sent a very expensive gift to the head eunuch of the wardrobe, because if your name isn't mentioned during the emperor's morning dressing routine, you might as well not exist. It was a bit of a monotone quality to life in the Byzantine court. Everything was ritualized. There was a book called the Book of Ceremonies that told you exactly how many steps you should take, when to bow, and what color of silk you should wear on a Tuesday in July. And the eunuchs were the masters of these ceremonies. They were the directors of the play. Imagine being a queen in this environment. You're the empress of the Romans, the most powerful woman in the world, but your entire life is managed by a group of men who are constantly watching you. They manage your schedule, they manage your ladies-in-waiting, and they report everything back to the emperor. There was no such thing as a private conversation. Every secret was a currency. Every look was a potential scandal. The high price of being the empress was that you were never, ever alone. You lived in a world of whispers, where the walls literally had ears, and those ears were usually attached to a man in a silk tunic who was very good at his job. Let's drift down the coast a bit, toward the later years of the empire. As Byzantium started to shrink and the money started to run out, the eunuchs remained. Even when the empire was just a few islands in a city wall, the hierarchy stayed intact. The ritual was the only thing they had left. There's a story about a eunuch named Nicephorus, who was basically the hatchman for Emperor Michael VII. He was so hated because he tried to centralize the grain trade, basically trying to make a buck off everyone's bread, that when the government finally collapsed, the mob didn't go for the emperor, they went for him. It turns out, being the invisible master is great until the lights come on and everyone realizes who's been pulling the strings. But even then, the system endured. It survived the fall of Constantinople and moved right into the Ottoman port we talked about earlier. It was a baton of bureaucracy passed from one empire to the next. The holy shadows of the Greeks became the gatekeepers of the sultans. As you lie there, drifting toward sleep, think about that continuity. Think about a world where for 1,500 years, the most stable part of the government was a group of men who weren't allowed to have a stake in the future. They lived entirely in the now, managing the beds, the bread, and the beauty of the world's most powerful people. They were the ghosts of the palace, the safe men who turned out to be the most influential players in the game. The lanterns in the great palace are dimming now, and the incense is burning out. We'll leave the angels of Byzantium to their mosaics and their music and float toward our next destination. So we followed the shadow masters through the silk-lined rooms of China and the golden domes of Byzantium. But to find the most literal version of the soprano tragedy, we have to float into the heart of the Baroque era, straight into the marble halls of the Vatican. It's one of those historical chapters that feels like a fever dream. We're in a time when the Catholic Church had a bit of a logistical problem. St. Paul had famously written that women should remain silent in church. Now, for the papal authorities, this was taken very literally. Women weren't allowed to sing in the choirs, but the music of the 16th and 17th centuries, the soaring, complex polyphony of Palestrina and Monteverdi, absolutely required high voices. So what do you do when you need a soprano but you've banned women? Well, the logical solution of the time was to create the castrati, because why change the rules when you can just change the boys? It's a dry, dark irony that the same institution that preached the sanctity of the body became the primary patron of a practice that systematically mutilated thousands of young boys every year. Because according to the logic of the day, a beautiful voice was worth more than a functional life. It was the high price of being God's favorite choir boy. Imagine a small village in Italy. You're a young boy with a promising voice. Your family is poor, maybe too many mouths to feed and not enough bread to go around. A scout from a cathedral or a music school comes through. They offer a scholarship. They offer a chance for you to become a star, a legend, a person who eats off silver plates and sings for the Pope. But there's a catch, a very sharp, permanent catch. The procedure was often hidden under the guise of medical necessity. Parents would claim their son had been bitten by a wild pig or fallen off a horse or suffered some mysterious inflammation that required surgery. It was a massive collective exercise in looking the other way. Thousands of boys, estimated at around 4,000 a year at the peak, were sent to surgeons, who were often just barbers with a side hustle. The result was a biological anomaly. Because they never hit puberty, their bones didn't stop growing when they were supposed to. The castrati often grew to be unusually tall, with long, spindly limbs and massive, barrel-shaped rib cages. This gave them a lung capacity that was superhuman. They could hold notes for minutes at a time. They could perform vocal acrobatics that would make a modern pop star's head spin. They were the first rock stars of Europe, but they were also tragic figures caught between worlds. They were men who could never be fathers, heroes who could never be husbands, and performers who were both worshipped and mocked. Let's talk about Farinelli. He's the one everyone remembers. He was the LeBron James of the castrati world. He was so famous that people would scream, "One God, one Farinelli," during his performances. He was wealthy beyond imagination. He was a favorite of kings. But Farinelli's life wasn't just about the applause. He eventually moved to Spain, where he became the musical therapist for King Philip V. Now, Philip V was, let's say, he was a bit mentally damp. He suffered from a crushing, paralyzing depression. He wouldn't wash, he wouldn't change his clothes, and he wouldn't get out of bed. So for 10 years, Farinelli sang the same 4 songs to the king every single night. Imagine being the greatest singer in the world, and your primary job is to be a human white noise machine for a guy who won't put on pants. It was a golden cage of a different sort. Farinelli had the power to soothe the mind of a monarch, but he was essentially a prisoner of the king's melancholy. Because why let your favorite singer tour Europe when he can stay in your bedroom and sing Polito il Sole for the 3,000th time? The atmosphere of the castrato world was one of intense, competitive loneliness. In the music conservatories of Naples, these boys lived a life of brutal discipline. They practiced for 8 hours a day. They studied literature, philosophy, and composition. They were being built into perfect instruments. But the failure rate was staggering. For every Farinelli, there were hundreds of boys who went through the surgery and didn't end up with a world-class voice. They ended up just as men with broken bodies and no future. They became the invisible ones of the church, singing in small village choirs or working as clerks, living reminders of a gamble that didn't pay off. And the ones who did succeed, they were treated like exotic animals. They were fashion icons. They wore the most expensive silks, the biggest wigs, and the most dramatic jewelry. But they were also the butt of every snarky joke in the coffee houses. They were called cap-ons or beardless wonders. The elite loved their voices, but they were uncomfortable with their presence. It was the same dynamic we saw with the eunuchs in the Forbidden City. We want your service, but we don't want your humanity. There's a strange, quiet tragedy in the way the castrato would spend their old age. Many of them, despite their wealth, lived in a sort of self-imposed exile. They built grand villas and filled them with art, but they had no heirs to leave it to. Farinelli spent his final years in a massive house in Bologna, surrounded by his harpsichords and his memories, a man who had been heard by millions, but understood by very few. Eventually, the world started to wake up from this particular fever dream. By the late 18th century, the Enlightenment started to ask annoying questions like, hey, is it actually okay to do this to children? And maybe we should just let women sing. The practice was gradually banned, though the Vatican kept its last castrato, Alessandro Moreschi, in the Sistine Chapel choir until the early 20th century. There are actually recordings of him. If you listen to them, they're haunting. They don't sound like a woman, and they don't sound like a man. They sound like a ghost. It's the sound of a world that no longer exists, a world that valued the aesthetic of a holy voice over the health of the singer. As you drift off, just imagine the sound of the Sistine Chapel at midnight, the moon shining through the high windows, the smell of old wax and cold stone, and in the choir loft, a group of men who paid the ultimate price to reach the high notes. They were the favorites of the church, the darlings of the opera, and the victims of a culture that couldn't decide if they were angels or monsters. The music was divine, but the silence that followed their lives was heavy. We've traveled from the broken feet of China to the broken voices of Rome. It seems the high price of beauty and power always involves a bit of structural damage. But don't worry about that now. The music is faded, the stage is dark. So we've touched on the rock star peaks of the castrati, the Farinellis and the golden villas, but to really understand the long, slow fading of this world, we have to look at the people who were left behind when the music changed. Because as the 18th century rolled into the 19th, the Enlightenment started to make people very uncomfortable with the biological reality of their favorite singers. It's one of those classic historical shifts where everyone suddenly realizes that the thing they've been cheering for is, well, kind of a nightmare. But even as the public grew squeamish, the Vatican, being the Vatican, didn't exactly move at the speed of light. They held on. They kept that angelic sound in the Sistine Chapel, long after the opera houses of Europe had moved on to tenors and sopranos with all their parts intact. And this brings us to the most poignant figure in this whole broken history, Alessandro Moreschi. Moreschi is a bit of a historical fluke. He was born in 1858, way after the practice was technically discouraged, but because he had a medical condition as a child, there's that phrase again, he became the last of his kind. He is the only castrato whose voice was ever captured on a recording. If you ever feel like falling down a very specific, very haunting rabbit hole, you can find these recordings from 1902 and 1904. The audio is scratchy, full of that old-school hiss and pop, but through it all comes this voice. And let me tell you, it's not what you'd expect. It's not pretty in the modern sense. It's piercing. It's got this strange sob-like quality to it, what the Italians called the messa di voce. Listening to it is like hearing a transmission from a different planet. You're listening to a man in his 40s, but the vocal folds are those of a child who never grew up. It's a biological time capsule. And the dry irony here is that by the time Moreschi was recording these tracks, he was already considered a relic. He was known as the Angel of Rome, but he lived in a world that was rapidly becoming embarrassed by him. Imagine being Moreschi. You walk through the streets of Rome at the turn of the century. Cars are starting to appear. Telephones are a thing. The world is modernizing, and yet you are a living piece of Baroque architecture. You are the physical embodiment of a 300-year-old policy of mutilation. He was the director of the Sistine Chapel Choir, which sounds like a very prestigious gig, and it was, but he was also a man who was essentially the last dinosaur. When he sang, people didn't just hear music, they heard the high price we've been talking about. They heard the centuries of boys who didn't get the villas or the fame, just the surgery and the silence. The life of a castrato in the twilight of the era was one of deep, quiet isolation. Moreschi lived with his brother, who was likely another castrato, in a small apartment near the Vatican. He was a devout man, a professional, a guy who took his role in the liturgy very seriously. But outside the chapel, he was a curiosity. There's a story that when he would walk through Rome, people would whisper and point, not out of admiration, but out of a kind of macabre fascination. He was a ghost who had forgotten to disappear. And then, in 1903, the new pope, Pius X, finally put an end to it. He officially banned castrati from the chapel, decreeing that whenever it is necessary to employ the high voices of sopranos and contraltos, these parts must be taken by boys. It was the end of a 1,000-year loophole. Moreschi was allowed to stay on as a director emeritus until he retired, but the factory, the slow, systematic creation of these voices, was finally shut down. Moreschi died in 1922, alone in his apartment during a flu outbreak. No grand state funeral, no "one God, one Moreschi" chants, just a quiet end to the loudest, most controversial vocal tradition in human history. It's fascinating to think about the price of the favorite in this context. The church wanted a sound that didn't exist in nature, a sound that was pure and untouched by the messy realities of human growth. And to get it, they were willing to pay with the lives of thousands of boys. When you hear that scratchy recording of Mereshki singing Ave Maria, you aren't just hearing a song, you're hearing the end of a world. You're hearing the final vibration of a string that was stretched too tight for too long. The Vatican's halls are silent now, at least of that particular sound. The angels have all been replaced by children who will eventually grow up, whose voices will eventually break, and who will live regular, boring, functional lives, which, in the grand scheme of things, is probably for the best. As you settle into the final layers of sleep, think about the silence that Mereshki left behind. The high price was finally deemed too high. The gold guards were taken off the nails, the silk bandages were unwound from the feet, and the choirs were filled with voices that were allowed to change. The candles in the Sistine Chapel are being snuffed out one by one. The incense has settled into the carpets. The ghosts of the favorites, the broken, the beautiful, and the beautifully broken, are finally finding a place to rest.